Getting ready to get some fabulous information in your basket.
Hello, Dale. And Alan Nussbaum, I understand you're an accomplished photographer. So I will encourage you to chime in if you have advice or observations, or I'll give you some time in our discussion in the second half. You shouldn't feel shy about contributing.
So I think we're going to begin. And I thank you all for joining us. My name is Lily Filler, and I am president of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. And I want to thank you for attending. This is one of our premier programs. This is the first time that we've done something like this. And so it's not going to be by the crowds and the hordes of many. It's going to be by those that we felt would be interested and those that have expressed an interest in learning more about our topic this evening or this afternoon, how to document your synagogue and other buildings for planning, protection, and posterity. We welcome you, and we hope you join us on Zoom for our other programming and become a member of the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. We welcome you. So this program is sponsored by the Society and is dedicated to the studying, preserving, promoting awareness of the history and culture of the Jews of South Carolina. We also see our responsibility extending to the archiving of our synagogues in our state. We have so many small synagogues that were once vibrant, but now are barely surviving or are already closed. We need to be able to tell their stories to the future generations. Today, we are thrilled to welcome back Dr. Sam Gruber. Dr. Gruber is an American art and architectural historian and historic preservationist. He has written extensively on the architecture of the synagogue and is an expert and activist in the documentation, protection, and preservation of historic Jewish sites and monuments. This limited seminar will help you get started with the right tools to achieve success with photographing and archiving. And probably assisting Dr. Gruber today will be Dr. Dale Rosengarten, who most of you already know. She is a curator of the special collections at the College of Charleston and the founding director of the Jewish Heritage Collection. She is also a professor at the College of Charleston and knows our state very well. Now I'd like to introduce you to our executive director, Rachel Barnett, who is responsible for the logistics of the program, but will also explain to you why this program in particular is so important to all of us. Rachel.
Thank you, Lily. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really happy to have such a nice group join us. This came about last summer. I guess when we met with Sam, presented South Carolina Synagogues on Zoom. Many of you may have joined us for that program. And it was very acutely made aware that the fact that we have our beautiful synagogues across our state, but there is no repository for documentation in photography for all of our synagogues. And it was an uneven playing field, particularly when Sam went to put together the PowerPoint. We have images, but they vary. So we had a great discussion. Sam agreed to come and do this workshop with us. We hope this is the beginning of a wonderful project for the Jewish Historical Society, but also for each of you who belong to your communities and your synagogues. The whole point of this is for us to document your synagogues through photography and through other images, and as well as the history and other documentation. Sam's going to lead us through that today, but I want to make a point that this is a Jewish Historical Society project. And once we have gathered this information, our plan will be to build this out on our website, where we will have pages for each of the synagogues in the state. But also you will have those images and that information as well to use in your communities on your own websites or however you choose. This is also a part of a much larger project that Dale and Ashley Walters are leading with Sam, and that is through the Pearlstein Lipoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture, and that is called documenting the Southern synagogues. South Carolina, we are sort of the trial balloon for this, if you will, because we realize the need is great. So I welcome you all. I'm excited to see such a great turnout, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it back to Lily.
So as a reminder, this session will be recorded and will be available later on in the week. You can get it on our YouTube channel or a link to the Facebook of the Jewish Historical Society. And in order to limit interruptions, I urge you to keep yourself muted during the presentation. The presentation is going to be divided into two segments. The first segment will be a PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Gruber. We're going to take a small break between hour 1 and hour 2. And in hour 2, it will be more of a discussion that Dr. Gruber will engage in with all of you. If you have questions, you certainly can put them in the chat and you can address them to everyone, or you could address them directly to me and I'll make sure they get to Dr. Gruber. But we're a small enough group that I think that when you want to ask a question, unmute yourself, ask your question, and then you can remute yourself. As we start this program now, we'd like to know who is on, why, where are you from? And so we're gonna kind of call on you because you don't know what order I see you in, and just give your name and what city or town you're in. We'd like to hear that. And because there's so many of us and we have a lot to cover, that's really all the information that we need today. So let's go ahead and begin with David Drazen. So unmute yourself and then remute.
Yeah, I'm from Anderson, South Carolina. We have a synagogue that's over 100 years old.
Thanks, David. Okay, Lee Kamen.
Originally from the Twin Cities in Minnesota, now in downtown Charleston.
Welcome back to South Carolina. Lauren Ellis.
Hi, I'm Lauren Ellis. I am originally from Aiken, South Carolina, and currently in Roanoke, Virginia.
Very nice. Barb Mark.
Hi, I'm Barbara Mark from Beaufort, and our synagogue is Beth Israel, and it's well over 100 years old.
Welcome, thank you. Mary Kay Laban.
Laban.
Laban. We have a Laban spelled the same way here in Columbia.
Okay, I'm from Beaufort, as is Barbara. Beth Israel is my synagogue.
Very good. Alan Nussbaum.
I am from Charleston and grew up at KKBE and currently am a member of both KKBE and Emmanuel. And I would be very interested in being involved in some of the photography of other synagogues in the state. I'm connected in other places. My family's been here for a while, and I would love to be involved in this.
Well, great. We will take advantage of that. You could bet on that. Dale Rosengarten, just kind of give us a brief summary of you.
Hi, everybody. I've been working at the College of Charleston Library for 26 years now, building the Jewish Heritage Collection. Sam and I've known each other for a very long time, and we've worked on several projects together. He curated for us a beautiful online exhibit called Life of the Synagogue, which I'll put the address in the chat in a minute, but it's based on iconography from our massive Rabbi Rosenthal collection. And the concept and the topical organization that you see is entirely was Sam's invention. So when we finished that, Sam proposed that we go back to Rosenthal and cull from this literally thousands of postcard images, the ones of Southern synagogues. It was a pretty good sampling, not at all comprehensive and obviously limited to a time period, but I think Sam, he'll probably describe it. I think we've got somewhere between 75 and 100 images. So of course we immediately took him up on it and found funding here and there. And for several years now, Sam and I have been working on this. I'm going to call it a manuscript, Sam, because it really is. It's going to be a book on the web. It's a really detailed and very brilliant scholarly treatment of Southern synagogues, not just South Carolina. In fact, I believe we have very few from South Carolina, which is one of the reasons we're so excited about the Historical Society's project, because we can add to our archives things we don't know. Anyway, that's a long way to say that I love Sam Gruber. I love working with Sam Gruber, and I'm so thrilled that he's willing to turn his talents to the little state of South Carolina. He's more often further afield in Europe or in the Middle East, but we've got him in the American South now, so that's really good for us.
Thanks, Dale. And for those of you that are just joining us, welcome. We're introducing ourselves and just saying where we're from. Mitchell.
Yeah, hi. I'm Mitchell at work. I live in Greenwood, South Carolina, where I don't know that there are any other Jews, but I go to Beth Shalom in Columbia. And I too would like to take as many pictures of as many synagogues in South Carolina as you want.
And I understand you've already started that at Beth Shalom, so we thank you, and we will be looking forward to using your expertise as well. Thank you so much.
Word gets around. Thank you.
Jeffrey Rosenblum.
Hi, I'm here in Charleston, belong to both KKBE and Synagogue Emmanuel. The interest in this for me is it seems that preservation groups and historic societies have great interest in many of the buildings in South Carolina. Unfortunately, their interest does not go to Jewish historical structures. And if we don't document them, my fear is that there's several at risk right now that really do need to be documented urgently. In addition to pictures, hopefully it would be nice, perhaps even get some students to provide a floor plan of each of the facilities.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And again, I'm welcoming those that are just coming on board. We're just going around now and asking for your name and where you're from. Ashley?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Walters, and I'm an assistant professor of Jewish studies here at the college, and I'm here in Charleston.
Thank you. Penny Blackman.
Hello, I'm Penny Blackman. I live in Columbia, but I grew up in Walterboro, South Carolina, and I'm here to do some research on our synagogue in Walterboro, Mount Sinai.
Thank you. Della Hertzberg. Unmute yourself, Della.
Hello, I'm Della Hertzberg. I'm from Aiken, South Carolina, and with the Congregation of Adath Yeshurun. This year, 2021, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary of our synagogue, and we're having a lot of festivities, but we decided to push it off to 2022. We also are doing a exhibit at the museum in Aiken. It's going to be called The Source of Light, and it will be next spring. We have also applied for a registry for historic places, so I'm very interested to know what Dr. Gruber has to say about that. And in 2014, we were honored by the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina with a historic plaque in front of our synagogue, and we proudly exhibit it. Thank you.
Thank you, Della. Betsy Laban.
I am Mary Kay's daughter, and I am also Beth Israel in Beaufort, South Carolina.
Wonderful. Okay, Andy Polikoff.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andy Polikoff. I live in Spartanburg. I've lived here all my life. I grew up here. We're especially interested in this right now because we have a synagogue that's over 100 years old that is actually in other hands, but the private owner is willing to cooperate with us, and we're wanting to do what we can to restore and renovate and preserve that structure. And you're going to hear from my friend Joe Wachter, who's working with us on that too.
Thank you, Andy. And I'll go to Joe right now. Joe Wachter.
Hello, I'm Joe Walker in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm working, I grew up in Spartanburg. I live in Myrtle Beach. I'm a lawyer. I grew up in Spartanburg. I've been doing extensive historical research on the community up there. And I'm working with. Hello?
Yeah, you're still there. Whoever's not muted, please mute yourself other than Joe.
Okay.
Andy, please mute yourself. And Steve Alterman, please mute yourself. Okay, very good. Go ahead, Joe.
Anyway, I'm working with Andy Polikoff. We're trying to help preserve and restore the original synagogue building in Spartanburg. And we just recently started meeting with Sam Gruber to help us with that project. We're looking forward to this meeting today.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. Stephen Alderman, now unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Steve Alderman. I'm currently in Boynton Beach, Florida, formerly from New Haven, Connecticut, but I'm interested in synagogue architecture and preservation.
Very nice. Thank you, Stephen. Barbara Freed. Barbara? Okay, she must have stepped away. So I would ask now, just everyone make sure that you're muted, and I'm going to turn the program over to our guest, Dr. Sam Gruber.
Thanks, Lily, and welcome to you all. It's a pleasure to be back in South Carolina, so to speak, although I'm sitting at my desk in Syracuse, and today I can say sunny Syracuse, quite a unusual event. So this came about when last summer I gave a presentation sort of on short notice on the synagogues of South Carolina, and casting around for information, I was somewhat frustrated about how little hard information there was on the history of the synagogues. Even putting together a list of all the synagogues was not that easy. But what particularly was frustrating was how few images there were of the buildings, both the buildings past, those that were synagogues and are no longer being used as such, some of which have been demolished, but many of which still stand and have new lives as new institutions, churches, public buildings, and the like. But many of which are still in use, and how few of the synagogues still in use seem to have good available documentation as well. So that doesn't mean that people haven't photographed these buildings. They may have them in the synagogue records, which is great. They may have them in private collections. You know, there may have been a simcha, something took place there and people took a lot of pictures, but they're not accessible. So what we want to do is two things in this effort moving forward is to try to accumulate, to assemble, collate, if you will, all of the older photographs, and the older the better, because as I will discuss shortly, buildings undergo changes and we need to document those changes. There are good reasons for that. But we also need to do new photography. And so I was encouraged in this when Dale and Rachel introduced me to the terrific documentation, photographic documentation that Perry Weinberg did of the synagogue Temple Sinai in Sumter just recently. And that was sort of in conjunction with the social hall being transformed into a museum there, in conjunction with the county museum. And there's now a permanent exhibition on Jewish life and on the Holocaust that is joined to the synagogue, but administered administered independently. And you know, I thought if people could see how beautiful some of these places are, they would think differently of them. They would think of them to begin with, and begin to think about their importance in the past and their importance today, and how we should deal with them in the future as our congregations evolve. My own congregation here in Syracuse, and I'll show you several pictures of this during the presentation, has been going through a massive transition. I haven't been happy with it all the time. In fact, there's a congregational meeting right now that I think I'm missing because of this. And the building, which was dedicated in 1911, is being sold, and the congregation is moving because it can't afford things, but also they were offered so much money for the site that the leadership felt they couldn't refuse. And whatever the pros and cons of it, one of the results is that we as a congregation have decided that though the sanctuary will be saved and other buildings will be torn down and there will be development there, the whole complex needs to be fully documented because certainly this part of its history is ending, and it needs to be remembered in the future. And we are doing that following the standards of the Historic American Buildings Survey. The building is already on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is deemed architecturally significant here in the city of Syracuse. So it didn't take any work at all to persuade the Library of Congress and the Historic American Buildings Survey to be willing to include this in this particular archive that I'll mention later on. And so going about this documentation process, with this in mind, with the South Carolina experience in mind, I realized that there really should be some program developed in which congregations and lay people can also be engaged and involved and do a lot of the work, sort of crowdsourcing work, if you will, to document their own synagogues. And it doesn't have to be at the same level as the Historic American Building Survey, but most of the lessons learned in that process can also be applied even if you're shooting with your iPhone, or hopefully something different as well. But anyone can really learn how to do this type of work. And that's what we're going to discuss today. I do have the PowerPoint that I showed earlier, well, in 2020 about the synagogues in South Carolina. I'm not going to show it, but if need be, we can dip into it later in the second half, because it brings together images of many of your synagogues, and it just shows how limited the information is on synagogues from earlier periods. Okay, I'm going to share my, so to go back to the rules, feel free to put questions in chat. If you really have an urgent question, you can, or just tired of hearing me speak and want me to take a break, which, like my students, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. If it's not a pressing question, but a general one, you can put it in the chat so you don't forget, or just jot it down, and then we'll address it in the second half. We're already at 3:25, so I think I'll go till about 4 o'clock. I'll try to go to about 4 o'clock with the PowerPoint, and then we'll see how we get through that. We can always pull up some of that in the second half too, as we have discussion. So when you're not speaking, stay muted. I see all of you are muted now, and that's just great. And I do want to give a shout out to Andy and Joe, and glad you're here. And we're not going to talk about your project today, but we can in the second half bring up some special aspects of it. Okay, here we go. I'm going to share screen, and should be this one. And we want to get to the beginning. Slideshow, current slide. Okay. Can everybody see this first slide? Oh, you're muted, so you can't tell me that, but somebody, Lily, just put your thumbs up. Everything is good. Okay, good. I'm seeing some of you on the on the side. So, but I'm not going to tell you which of you I'm seeing. So that means you do have to pay attention because I could be looking right at you. You just don't know it. Okay, so why do we document synagogues? We're all interested in synagogues, and we're interested in synagogues as representations of Jewish history, Jewish community, present-day Jewish life. There are personal stories, family stories, community stories, regional stories, national stories, immigration stories. There's so much that's embodied in our synagogue buildings. And in America, more than, say, other countries like Poland in the 19th or early 20th century, synagogues really embody Judaism and represent Judaism for Jews themselves, and then also for non-Jews who look at synagogues and see them as Jewish churches, so to speak, but they see them as the physical expression of their brethren, of their countrymen who are Jews who are residing with them. That's especially true in the South, where there are many, many instances of synagogues being on Church Street and being aligned with other churches. I think of Port Gibson, Mississippi, which was the very first Southern synagogue I visited more than 30 years ago. So that's important. They're important, sometimes they're important architecturally, sometimes they're not. But even when they're not significant architectural buildings, sort of as works of art, as works of a significant architect or artist, they still are valuable as doorways into larger questions of cultural and social history, because you often learn more from something that's modest from something that's grand. The grand thing may be the exception, the modest thing may be the norm. And if we want to know how our ancestors lived, if we want to know how our parents and grandparents lived, it's more likely we want to know the norm. I've just finished transcribing my grandmother's memoir, and it's amazing the things she doesn't say in that memoir. And as one of my cousins said, well, I think it's because Judaism was in the air they breathed. You didn't have to talk about all these things that you did every day. You know, she baked on Friday because before Shabbat, they had kept a kosher household, but she never mentioned it in the memoir. They sat Shiva for my grandfather when he died. It's not mentioned in the memoir because these were the ordinary things. And yet for us today, they're not so ordinary. So it's important for us to try to remember them. And sometimes the synagogue buildings and the records of the synagogue are a way to do that. These are just four that you'll recognize. And of course, we have several people here from Beaufort. I think I said it right this time. I think I was castigated in the summer when I mispronounced Beaufort. So history is really important. And we can find a lot out from the location, the size, orientation, material, design, decoration, furnishings, all of these things. They tell us something about the congregation. They tell us about their resources, how much they could afford. They tell us about their tastes and influences. Where were they getting their information from churches that were nearby, from Jewish publications and magazines, from international art and architecture magazines? What were they being exposed to? How did they make their decisions? And we can see their aspirations. Did they want to put on a big face for their community and show off? Or did they want to hide in the corner and not let anybody see them and be very, very modest? Did they want to make their building look like a public building, like a courthouse or a school or a bank? Did they want it to look like a church in a style that is common to a church? Or did they want it to look distinctly Jewish, something that was so different so everyone would know the people using this building were special? And we sometimes have styles that did not originate as Jewish styles, but say the Moorish style at Sumter is really the best example in South Carolina, which came to be associated with Judaism from the third quarter of the 19th century and into the 1920s. So there are those things as well. Sorry, I'm just closing my door. We're going to talk about this documentation. Who wants it? Who wants it? Well, I think the individual congregations, local historical societies, families will be interested in this, but there are national and international organizations that are very keen on collecting this information, although most of them don't have the means to do it. There is right here, as we've already heard from Rachel, the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina, and we've heard from Dale, the College of Charleston, especially the library there is collecting this material. There's the Center for Jewish Art and Hebrew University. I'm actually in the process of donating a lot of 30 years of my own photographs to them to go up online. And there's the International Survey of Jewish Monuments, which I'm the head of, and we encourage we've been encouraging crowdsourcing, since the 1970s to collect this kind of information. Somebody mentioned the National Register of Historic Preservation. They're thinking about getting the synagogue on. Well, that's the State Historic Preservation Office, and they want this information, but they don't usually have the staff to initiate and carry out the research and the photography, but they will review it and refine it once a local person, a congregant or a paid consultant brings it to their attention. And then I mentioned the Historic American Building Survey. This is usually focused on really remarkable and special works of architecture, but it also includes more humble vernacular buildings too, if the case can be made. And to date, only 30 synagogues have been documented fully for the Historic American Building Survey. There's a very small percentage of buildings in this corpus of American architectural history. Surprisingly, when we proposed Temple Concord in Syracuse, I believe it was the very first from New York State to be proposed. Now I know that Kehillah Kadosha, sorry, not Kehillah Kadosha, but yeah, KKBE is already documented in HABS, Historic American Building Survey. And that's why we have a lot of great drawings and other materials that were collected, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s. And those have been published as well. And they're very valuable materials to use. Okay, so these are some of the photos that we pulled this last summer of buildings that we might think of as important if we knew more about them. This is the first, believed to be the first Temple Sinai in Sumter that was replaced by the one that's there now, built about 1912. This is probably from the 1890s. It may have been designed by a well-known and one of the first American Jewish architects, Alfred Eichberg. But as far as I know, this is the only photo that exists. There are no drawings, no plans, and there are no descriptions either. If I'm wrong, that's exciting. I look forward to being corrected. But you can see that if we had full documentation of a building like this, it would be fascinating. And it would probably, have made its way into a book like Rachel Vishnitzer's book on American synagogues that was published in the 1950s, even my book that was published in 2003. But we don't, so it's neglected, it's forgotten. It just is written out of history for the most part. This is a little, maybe the only photograph, but it's an interesting photograph of the first building for the Tree of Life Synagogue in Columbia, which has gone through several iterations. Again, I don't know anything more about this building. There may be people in Columbia who do, but imagine if we had a long shot and showed it, does this building in the context of its neighborhood? Was it a residential neighborhood? Probably, but we don't know. Imagine if we knew what the inside looked like. Is this the sanctuary we're looking at, or a chapel, or what is it? It's got stained glass windows, but we don't know what the configuration or the ground plan of the building was. What were the windows like? All we can see is that they were there, kind of Gothic style. Were they pattern windows? Did they have symbols? Was there Hebrew written on them? These are all mysteries because we have such fragmentary documentation. And this, what I'm saying about these two photographs could be said 100 times, or maybe 1,000 times. Because when we think before World War I, no, before World War II, maybe there were 3,000 synagogues across America. We have documentation for, I don't know, but I'm going to guess probably not more than a third of them, maybe half. I don't know. But a huge number have been lost. And surprisingly, even though about 1,000 synagogues were built after World War II, we actually have pretty bad documentation on those buildings too. So we want to move forward. Okay, so for history, that's really important. For protection, that's another reason. People don't think about this too often when they're going about documenting a building, particularly people with a historical bent. But if you're on a facilities committee for a synagogue, as I was for nearly 20 years, it's really important that everything be documented, because if there's a fire or a flood or vandalism or some other disaster, you need to be able to know what was lost and how to replace it. And sometimes that can be very important that you can show documentation. I'll just show you a few examples of where this is important, or where too bad we don't have that information. But my rule, whenever I tell someone to photograph a synagogue, and whenever I now photograph a synagogue, is think as if you are the last person to ever see this building intact, that tomorrow it might disappear. And the corollary is, and the only information that posterity will have is the photographs that you're taking today. That's really important. The only information posterity will have is the photographic record that you're taking today. Now, that may not be true, but so often it is that I think it should be a hard and fast rule. And for example, the only reason we know so much about the wooden synagogues of Poland that were mostly destroyed by the Germans and their collaborators between 1939 and 1942 is because an intrepid team of architectural historians and photographers and artists documented a lot of these in the interwar years. Basically missions from the Polish Institute of Architecture, led by a Jewish architectural historian and architect, Simon Zajek. All of the people involved in this survey were killed in the Holocaust, every single one, pretty much. But a good part of the documentation survived. Some of it was destroyed in the destruction of Warsaw, not the ghetto uprising, but the Warsaw uprising. But a lot survived because it was in different locales. And then this was gradually collated in the post-war period by Maria and Maciej Piechota and other people, and these photos come from their books. So we wouldn't know any of this if that work hadn't been done. Now, in the 1990s, I had the opportunity to sponsor documentation of synagogues in Syria. This was during the Oslo period, where there was a brief opening, and the photographer Robert Lyons managed to get permission to go in and photograph. And there were 21 sites we identified, and he got to photograph 18 of them before the secret police just got tired of following him around and basically kicked him out of the country. This documentation is more valuable than gold because it is the only photographic documentation in most of these places. And probably even before the Syrian war, a lot of these had begun to close because a lot of Jews emigrated after 1995, and they would have taken a lot of the Judaic, but everything was intact back in 1995. These synagogues were open and functioning. This one on the right is the famous Jobar Synagogue. It was probably destroyed in 2014. We don't know for sure. It was reported destroyed in 2013. It wasn't, but most likely it was destroyed in 2014. We don't know what's happened to those other sites that Robert documented, but my guess is they are mostly empty shells, even if they're standing. If they survived, they would have been probably looted. We just don't know. In America, closer to home, the great Central Synagogue in New York, Henry Fernbach, 1872, one of the great Moorish synagogues, one of the great New York synagogues, designed by a Jewish architect, really, really important. Terrible fire. When they were doing restoration work, terrible fire in 1999. The roof burned, it caved in, destroyed the interior. More recently, fire in Seagate, Brooklyn, 2017. Now, fortunately, the Central Synagogue was fully documented because it was undergoing a restoration project. And the congregation managed to win a $35 million lawsuit, I think, against the contractors, the roof contractors, Tishman Construction, because they were negligent and caused the fire. Then they didn't report it. I actually was an expert witness. A whole day I had to spend being bullied by lawyers. But the congregation recouped all that money, or I should say the insurance company recouped all that money, and that allowed them to reinvest in the building and restore it so that it is quite beautiful today. And I should show you a picture, but I'm not. And then was it last year or 2 years ago now? I'm trying to think. I'm blocking my own label here. 2019, this synagogue in Duluth burned down. And it was an Orthodox synagogue, and they really didn't want anyone documenting it. They didn't want anyone trying to preserve it. They wanted to just leave it or sell it. They adamantly believe that once a synagogue was no longer a synagogue, it shouldn't serve any other purpose. Whatever the cause of the fire, it burned down, and we have very little documentation. My friend Marilyn Chiat sent me 2 photographs in 1990. And I just heard from her today. I emailed her last night. I said, did we ever get more documentation on that building? And she said, no, they never let us back in. They were adamant. They wouldn't allow anyone to photograph. And all we have is these few photographs from the 90s. And that's tragic. This was a major synagogue up on the Iron Range in Minnesota, very important in the history of Jewish settlement in Minnesota. And it wasn't a beautiful, it was a very simple space, but it had an interesting arc. It had some nice stained glass, but more the feel of the place is gone forever. Okay, so those are fires. We suffer those every day. South Carolina, Charleston, you know about hurricanes and flooding. Well, this is becoming almost an annual event, and with climate change, it's going to get worse. So our coastal communities, New Orleans, Charleston, New York, many other places are going to suffer. Sandy, back in 2012, 63 synagogues damaged. And here are a couple of them. This is, the date's wrong, it's 2013, should be 2012. This is in a couple synagogues in the aftermath. And then Harvey, a little bit later, 2018 in Houston, devastated a lot of synagogues. One of the worst was the United Orthodox synagogues that you see here. Some buildings had to be demolished entirely. Okay. So protection, history protection, then planning is very important too. For congregations that are either growing or that are downsizing, if you know your building, you're better able to adapt it for future use. You can repair systems, or you can, my dog just came in. Okay, go lie down, go lie down. You can repair systems, or you can rebuild systems. And if you know what's there, it kind of helps you decide better, make better decisions. It helps the congregation to make better decisions too. And it's also good for promotion. If you can tell people your story, tell people the history of your building, history of your architect, if it's a Jewish architect, history of your rabbis, history of your windows, history of your involvement in local civic affairs, anything, that's a way to connect with community. It's a way to build your congregation's identity and self-esteem and pride and recruit new members. And it also is a way to raise money, which is really, really important, to go to foundations and other places. All right, so how do we go about doing all of this? You need to know your building, and those of you who are stationary in the places where that you want to document, you are lucky because you have time. When I visit synagogues, when I document, I rarely have time. I just did an article it was published last January on a 48-hour visit to Rhode Island, where I documented 4 synagogues and a Hillel house in 48 hours. That's really fast, and you have to be very organized, and you're not going to get everything. One thing it does, it means you try to document everything visually that you can and do the research later. But it's never perfect. When you're if you're in Aiken, or if you're in Spartanburg, or if you're in even in looking at the new synagogues in Myrtle Beach, if you're there, if you go to document and you don't get something, you can go back. If you go there and it's raining or it's cloudy, you can come back on a sunny day. You have the luxury of time. You have the luxury of getting to know the building, doing a walkthrough first and identifying all the important features before you actually go in to photograph. Or you can do test shots. How is the best light to shoot in this direction, to shoot this window, to shoot this parochet, or whatever it is that you want to do. So time is your friend as long as you have access to the synagogue. Now, sometimes you're in a place where there's an old synagogue, and even though you're there physically, you're still only going to get a little bit of time in to document it. It could be used for a private residence, it could be a church, could be a store. And they say, okay, grudgingly, you've been nagging me, come on in for an hour. You can have an hour to shoot. And then it's still the same. You have the luxury to do the research locally, but you're still under a time crunch. So this is just the time, this is the a timeline that I've been developing for my own synagogue. And I have the luxury of having been on the facilities committee for so long and having access to all of the files and notes that I was putting in every little repair, much more than is really necessary. When you start going back to the 60s, no one can remember exactly, well, when were those recessed lights put in? When did they change the windows in the sanctuary? And so it's a little fuzzy there, but we know they were changed. And then you go back to the 20s and you wonder, was this original from 1910 or was this put in 1929? Then it gets more difficult. But the idea is to try to get to know things as well as you can. And if you can do that before you photograph, you're going to get better results. But if not, you still try to photograph everything. And then when you're doing your research, you'll have the visual imagery to assist. So there are lots of ways to research the history of a synagogue, and we're not going to discuss that today because those will be the subject of later programs and things that Dale is doing and things that Rachel's doing in the Historical Society. But just know that in an ideal world, when you have resources and you have time, you can look at architectural drawings. And in my synagogue, we were lucky that after being lost for 70 years, the original architectural drawings for the synagogue were discovered in an architect's office, because that office, which is the oldest active architectural office in New York State, was asked to plan an addition in the 1920s. And they took the plans and their addition was never built, but they never gave the plans back. So the temple plans were in this architectural firm's file for that long. Minute books. We're lucky because we have the minute books, and after about 1920, they're typed and they're easy to read. Before that, they're handwritten and not so easy to read, but that tells you the decisions that were being made to make changes. Newspapers. This is a fragment from a Jewish newspaper from Texas about the Orthodox Adath Yeshurun synagogue being dedicated. I can't read the date, but I believe it's 1908 or 1910. We have, again, newspapers, we have postcards. This one is from the Rosenthal collection, and this will be in the exhibition that Dale mentioned. But if you go online or if you read in any of the history books about Temple Beth Israel in Houston, they're going to tell you it was built, they moved here in 1908, and then in 1925, they moved out to a new building designed by the very important architect Joseph Finger, a Jewish architect in Texas. And then they say, and then it became a church, and in 1971 it was torn down. But what they don't tell you is that it actually became the first conservative synagogue in Houston for a short while in the 1920s and early 30s. And it was Temple Beth El. I happen to have a photograph from my mother's scrapbook. This is my mother's confirmation picture. She's right here. And I looked at it and I said, what is this building? Where is Temple Beth El? Where is this taken? And I did a little research and I found out that this new conservative congregation purchased the building from Beth Israel. but the congregation didn't make a go of it. And eventually they merged with another congregation. And so they were only in this building for a while. But this is the only interior photograph that, and then there are other ones exactly like it for other confirmation years that are now at the new Jewish archive, Houston Jewish Archive at Rice University. But they're the only pictures that I found because nobody ever bothered to take an interior view of the entire sanctuary, or to stand on the bima and take it toward the door, or to take pictures of the stained glass windows that we actually see are here in the building. We get these confirmation pictures. So at least we get the arc, but we don't get that much more. So when you're working today, you need to do better. So this is the way it looked when it was a church, and this is the way it is today. Okay, so photographing your building, how do we go about doing it? There are some rules and there's some ideas. And just remember, none of these, you can't do all of these. This is sort of aspirational. But there are a couple of things. I always talk about corners and centers. So when you're on the outside, always shoot the corners, because that way you get two sides of a building together and you shoot it from every angle. So I always walk around the building first. That's the first thing I do if I can. Or if I'm scheduled, I only have an hour and they're going to let me in at a particular time, I might walk around afterward. But that whole walk around is really important. If you're living in a place that you're documenting, you probably want to do it more than once because the light changes. And in the morning, you're going to have light on one side of the building and not on the other. In the afternoon, the reverse. But usually I find a minimum, even with wide angle lens, of about 8 shots will get you the entire exterior. But if it's a big complex with lots of add-ons, each block of the building is going to add several shots. The interior, the same thing. Each room, but let's talk about the sanctuary first, should be shot from the corner. Stand in a corner and get a raking shot across. And I'll show you this in diagrams and in examples. And then from each side, you take directly. What we tend to see are mostly just direct shots. When we have an interior shot, it's often taken from the door all the way to the ark at the opposite end. And it's this one view. And if it's a Reform synagogue, it's likely to have a central aisle. So it just shoots right up the aisle. But you've all been in synagogues. You've all gone to congregation to services. Nobody sits in the aisle. Nobody really experiences the space that way. You're off in a corner, you're in a pew. And when things get boring, when the rabbi's sermon really begins to drag, you start looking around, turning your head, looking for details, looking at the windows, looking at the Jewish stars, whatever it is. And you see the building from lots of different angles. And most photographers never appreciate that and never capture that. Now, one place I do want you to go, if you've never been there before, is the website synagogues360.org. And there are over 500 synagogue sanctuaries which have been photographed by my friend Louis Davidson, who sadly passed away this last year. But there are over 300 from the United States, and there are 6 from South Carolina. And what Louis did, he would go in a sanctuary and he stitched together the pictures. He would take full pictures all the way around and up and down, ceiling and floor, stitch these together, and using software, you create a 360 degree, like a movie, and you can look all the way around. Fantastic, fantastic for sanctuaries. But Louis was not so interested in the exteriors, and he wasn't interested in any ancillary spaces in the synagogue. For him, it was only the sanctuary. So we don't get kitchens, we don't get classrooms, we don't get offices, we don't get libraries, we don't get all those other places that we know make a synagogue today. Okay, so details, really important. Don't hold back. Everybody loves detail. No detail is too small. And with digital photography, we're not constrained anymore by the cost of film. It used to be, and we can talk about this in the discussion afterward, that you would want to do few shots, but with as much detail. And that's why people use large format film negatives, because in an 8x10 negative, you could capture a lot of detail. So you could print out details if you needed them. Now, but it could take an hour to do a single shot. But now you can do much more and you can shoot more fully. And even if you think this will never be published, no one's ever wanted this in a book, someone may want to know, what was the talus rack like? What was the dedication plaque like? What were the yahrzeit lights like? And so on. So there are lots of things: doors, windows, inscriptions, plaques, the arc opening, closed, steps, doors, aisle, pews. If you think of yourself, how do you go through a synagogue? How do you use the synagogue? That's going to tell you what you see, and that should be remembered, and what's important and what to photograph. But they're different experiences. Everybody experiences things differently at a different time. If you're going on Shabbat, that's one experience. But if you're going for a concert or a class, it's another experience. If you're a congregant coming in the front door and sitting in a pew, that's one experience. But if you're the rabbi or the cantor who's up on the bima and maybe coming in from a back door, that's another experience. So when you're shooting, imagine, put yourself like a little play, be an actor and take on the parts of all the different players. I always stand at the rabbi's, at the bima. I always stand at the rabbi's pulpit and imagine that I'm speaking or I'm leading, and I take a picture. What does he see or what does she see when she is there? Similarly, imagine opening the ark, closing the ark. What's it like? And so you want to take things from different perspectives. Now, I don't know how many, if there are any, there are a few Orthodox synagogues that need to be documented in South Carolina. Always remember the women. Where were the women? So much has been documented about synagogues that neglects the women. Every book about synagogue architecture will have pictures of the sanctuary, but we'll never see pictures of the women's section. So it's very important to include that. And I actually have taken to trying to be in a sense, be a woman first, if you will, and say, well, where did the women go? And I go up to the women's gallery first. I'll follow the back steps that they have to take. Or it could just be in a big sanctuary. In a modern sanctuary, there's a mechitza dividing women's space right on the ground floor. But don't neglect the women's experience. Okay, change. Buildings change over time, and it's important that we document this. It's interesting historically, and then we want to think of the reasons. It's interesting architecturally. If you're doing something for the National Register of Historic Places, you're going to have to document this. So you want to get the earliest representation, a photo, plans, as possible, and then compare it with later things, and that may give you more indications of things that you should be attentive to when you're photographing and describing. So this is the first article about my synagogue. This was published in 1912, a year after the building opened. And here's the sanctuary, and this was the social hall. And then there's a detail. Today, the sanctuary is almost identical. It hasn't changed much, but this rear part has changed. The social hall in the 1920s was enlarged and totally redesigned. Kitchen was added here. A classroom building here was added in 1929, and then a big school was added in 1960. Now, I looked through my files and I looked through the temple's files, and there are lots and lots of pictures of the sanctuary. It has been well loved for many decades, and it's easy to find representations. There is virtually no documentation of the classroom buildings or the social hall spaces. So it's, and actually in the plan, those are going to be demolished, and there's going to be a big housing project here, a luxury housing project, which will preserve the sanctuary. So it's more important than ever that these be fully documented before they disappear. We can look at this is the first known photograph of the synagogue here. And while it looks almost exactly as today, this is my colleague Bruce Harvey, who's doing Habs documentation in large format, black and white. If you look behind, you can see that the classroom building is actually there, where there was actually houses here before. And then Bruce photographed that middle space, which never gets photographed. It's totally ignored. because the view that's always promoted is the view that the architect intended. This one here from the northwest coming from downtown, and you would see the temple up here on this little hill. And on the other side, similar, we have, this is the earliest image. This was a drawing that was submitted before the building was actually built, 1910, 1911. And then you can see in the 1920s and the 1950s, the social hall was significantly changed. And there were a few other changes as well. So if you know the original appearance, that can help you know what's important today. You'll know what's original, and the historic preservation offices love that, but you'll also know what's changed. I also suggest as a rule to populate your space. Now you're going to have to do these empty building pictures. That's what most people like. And if you want to talk about building history, that's important. But if you want to know your building and pass down its way it functioned for the congregation, you want to fill it with people. It's impossible to do that with buildings that are no longer synagogues. But while you still have a congregation, try to photograph while you have events. And unless you're Orthodox, you can now pretty much photograph any day. You can photograph even on Shabbat. Most people allow that. But even if you're Orthodox, you can photograph on Monday or Thursday, another day where there's might be a daily minyan or a service. These are photographs I shot just shortly. No, this was, I think, was this last year or 2 years ago? It was Purim at Kehillah Kadosha Synagogue in Yanina, a project I've been working on for a long time. And I just curated an exhibition that went online about the synagogue in February. And I think it's important to show it in use. So this is people, and there was no problem with me photographing on Purim, but I've been at the synagogue so often that I know everybody, so it's okay to do that. Okay. Now I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on how I approach sort of outsides and insides of buildings. And I just pulled this one up because I think it's the last synagogue that I photographed before COVID, certainly the last out-of-town synagogue. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. And, actually, I have this up here for another reason. This is about historic change. So I first saw this synagogue in 1912, and these are the photographs. So it was a gray day. I then came back in late 2000, I think it was 2018, or 2019, and it's slightly bluer day. You see a little more sun. In my files, I saw these two photographs and they looked almost identical, and I didn't even know there was a difference between them. I thought the angle, this was with my old Olympus camera, and this is with my new Sony mirrorless. But then when I put them on screen, I realized there were differences, and most notably, the star, the metal star that's up over the Decalogue on the facade here is missing on this more recent picture. And then I started comparing, and I'll show you another one in a minute. So this is, I've got to guess that was just out of place, that picture, because we're back to populating, and this is Kehillah Kadosha Yanina Synagogue at Purim again. And I made sure, even though I felt a little embarrassed and didn't want to intrude, so I didn't take a lot of details. I took at least one picture of the women upstairs in the gallery to show the women's space. Okay. So this is my colleague, Bruce Harvey. He uses a big box camera. He's shooting big, large format and medium format black and white film. Habs likes black and white film, which is the biggest reason that people do not submit more projects for Habs. If they ever go digital, there'll be a lot of people wanting to do that. So he's photographing the sanctuary at Temple Concord, that same building that I showed you earlier. And I just want to give you some idea of how we sort of go about photographing for something like this and for the National Register. And this is what you should probably do even for your own projects and congregations. The National Register actually requires that you do a little map like this, that you have a site plan or a building plan, and you have arrows showing where all the the shots are, and you actually have to number these. So it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, and these would correspond to your photo list, and that's important. But the main thing is you see corners and centers. So corners, long views are very important. Context is very important. We often don't get this. Today with Google Maps, we can really get context, contemporary context, but we often don't get the original context. It's important to know, was the building on a major street or on a side street? Was it visible from a distance, or did you just come right up against it? Did you, how close to it was to a residential neighborhood? Did people live nearby and walk right to the synagogue? Or did they drive? Was there a parking lot there? If it's a later synagogue, where did they park? And did they park right next to the synagogue or across the street? So context is really important. So I encourage a walk a little bit around the neighborhood and looking from many different directions. Can I see the synagogue? Can I see the synagogue? And when you can see the synagogue, take those pictures, the first views. But then as you come closer, you focus on the building. And this is, whoops, sorry. And this is center on the steps. You would actually take this further away across the street, but this is taking the full screen. Corner views, and that gets more than one wall in. And corner views are often the views that architects plan, because that's the way people see things, especially if it's on a corner site. You're seeing it from an intersection, and you're seeing two sides often at one time. In urban sites, there are not too many in South Carolina, a couple, Charleston, Columbia, where there's an older building and it's on a street in a tighter neighborhood. Those, they're still meant to be seen obliquely as you walk up the street, but you might also want to stand as far as you can across the street and take a frontal shot of the facade. There you might get some distortion, and that can these days be fixed in the post-production. We used to use perspective correction lenses for this and back in the film days, but so you want to get that front view. So this shows you the complex, and because it's the complex, you're getting lots of corners, so you've got to get shots into these sort of armpits of the building, so to speak, and these shots can be done as probably 35 millimeter. You can go to 24 on some of the wider ones. I sometimes even go to 16 if it's a really tight squeeze. Most cameras now have that zoom capacity, even phones, so that allows you to do that. The phones now have a wider screen, so you can actually catch more than we used to be able to catch with a different ratio. And but then if you see details, as I talk about, you'll want to also use maybe a 70 millimeter or ideally a telephoto to get a lot of the details. And the telephoto lens is really great for exterior details and for interior details if you can get far enough away, because what that does, it evens out the light, and you don't have to worry so much about, even if you're shooting automatic, your light reading will probably be okay for your telephoto, and you'll get a really crisp detail. For those of you who are more sophisticated with your photography, you can we'll talk in the discussion period about setting your exposures and that, but even using the automatic settings on most cameras today, you can get good pictures. Okay, so this is something that I'm going to prepare and send to all of you. But it's what I call a working list about what is a synagogue and what are the parts of the synagogue. And I haven't developed this yet as a kind of a checkoff form, but I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it for you guys. The main thing is the approach, and then the exterior. If you can look at the roof type too, is it a dome? Are there lanterns? Is it a gable roof? Is it a hipped roof? Is it a cross gable roof? Is it whatever it is? And by the way, these are all questions that you would have to answer if you're doing a National Register of Historic Preservation nomination. You look at the facade, doors, windows, grates, awnings, lots of things. And then the details, are there light fixtures? Are there sconces or torchères? Are there plaques and signs, balconies, and so on, all of the symbols. And pretty much every time you find something, you'll say, well, I'd like to have a detail of that. And you take that picture. So you're going to have a lot of pictures. We're already up into the 10s, 20s, 30s. I may end up taking 200 pictures when I'm finished with the building inside and out, if it's an interesting building. If it's less interesting, it could be 40 pictures, something like that. But with digital, the main effort is the labeling of them afterward. It takes more time to process the photographs than to take them sometimes. And then you go in, remember, there's usually a vestibule, and there's lots of interesting things in the vestibule before you even get to the sanctuary. Where are the prayer books? Is there a mezuzah? Is there a tzedakah box, a tallis rack, all these things. And then look for plaques. Plaques are really informative, and we don't want to forget them. So ceiling, floor, galleries, and so on. I think seating is really, really important. Seating tells you a lot about a congregation, so I spend a lot of time photographing seats. And then, of course, your arc is going to be the focus, and that will usually be the most artistic element. You want broad shots, general shots, detailed shots. The Ner Tamid will be there. And then you want to open and close the arc if you have that option. Just remember, get permission, because many congregations now have alarms on their arcs. Just don't go and open an arc without letting anyone know. And you'll often see many of the Torahs have beautiful ornaments, obviously the rimonim and the breastplates, but some of them will have beautiful Torah mantles, sometimes embroidered by members of the congregation. So you want to pay attention to that. Okay, so walking around a building. So this is that Sons of Jacob building from the 1920s, an immigrant shul in Providence, Rhode Island. I went here specifically because I knew there was wall painting, but I ended up being fascinated by the whole building. So this is a corner shot from the front. You see, I'm seeing the facade and I'm seeing a whole flank. It would have been good if I had a longer shot. I realized I didn't have a really long shot of this, and that was unfortunate. So the next time I go, I'll take that. This is a very good, except it's a little flat. The light's not on it, but it shows you the materials. A long shot, a center shot from across the street. There was an empty lot across the street, so I was able to go very far back in order to get this all in one frame. Sometimes you can't do it. Sometimes you have to use several frames. And here's the corner shot for the rear and the side. This is interesting because I hadn't noticed before, but in 1982, there was a fire escape here. In 2012, there was a fire escape. More recently it's gone. So there's been change in this building. I also realized only when I was taking these pictures and looking at the pictures, I knew I was there in the morning and the sun was on the facade. So that meant the sun was here on the east, which made this a very strange Orthodox synagogue, because the ark, which you see projecting here on the on the rear, is actually on the west. So if I come in the afternoon, I would get light here. So this is a very unusual, but very American adaptation. American Orthodox tended not to orient their synagogues, shall we say, religiously. They took advantage of whatever real estate they could afford, and then they built the building appropriately. It would have been inappropriate to use this real estate and then have the facade on this side, which is very unnoticeable. Instead, they're facing the city. Unfortunately, there's a highway that goes right there that tore down much of the Jewish neighborhood, but they faced a major street once before. The outside also, here we can use detail. So here I'm using probably a moderate telephoto, but I was using this lens here. This is a zoom. I think it's a 55 to 210 millimeter. And when I don't have much time, I use two lenses. One is a 16 to 50 zoom, and this is the other is this 55 to 210 zoom. And then I can get the details that I need. And the exterior details alert me to what I'm going to find on the inside. So when I see these windows and there's a panel between, it's not just one big window, I know there's going to be a balcony there. And sure enough, here's the balcony on the inside, and those are the windows that I was photographing. Similarly, here in the basement level, but it's not really basement, I'm seeing these stained glass windows. That allows me to know that there's a full floor lit, and that's going to be the Bet Midrash down here. Now you can see I was shooting here, I think, with the automatic setting, because I was shooting really fast because the caretaker was talking to me the whole time and I couldn't really focus. I just had to keep shooting while he explained everything to me. And so you see the stained glass windows here are washed out because the light is reading the setting for the ambient light, not for the windows. But I compensated later and took pictures of the windows focusing on them. Now on the other side, and this is very typical, it wasn't so easy to do the corner shots or the side shots because you see there's vegetation and then there's going to be a fence here and there's a lot line. So I had to take several shots. So this one gives me a better view of the facade, but this one I had to get under the tree, but it gave me a little bit more of the side. But even there, I'm not getting the full side of the building. So I have to take different views. I walk the side and I'm taking shorter views, but all together I can get a sense of the entire facade. While I'm doing that, I notice that there are details that are worth photographing, like here where there's been masonry repair. And that shows that this is the original brickwork and then this is more recent brickwork. So clearly, they had a grant, they got some money to do some restoration work, probably between 2012 and 2019. So here we get a little bit better view of the Bet Midrash and the stained glass windows, and even better here with the windows. The closer you get in on something, the more accurate your light reading. And again, the telephoto is fantastic for stained glass windows. And I won't go into stained glass windows here because we're going to do a full workshop, which I'll provide on Zoom as a recording for you. But it really, you have to trial and error. You really have to learn how to do stained glass right. Now here's the inside of that sanctuary. And there are a lot of ways to shoot it. This one, first, I'm shooting with all the lights on because the guy said, do you want me to turn on the lights? And I said, sure. So you can see what it would be like to have services here. This was one of the largest, I think it was the largest Orthodox shul in Providence. And you can see the wall painting. And this gives you a good view of a lot of the constituent elements. Wall painting of animals here up above the ark, lions in the Decalogue above the ark. We have sky painted in the ceiling, and we have the zodiac signs, the mausoleum is going around the ceiling. So this is a general shot from the doorway, and I'm looking over the bima and then up to the ark, but I'm going to have to take a lot of details. And I'm not going to take you through all of these details, but I'm sure I took 100 details in this interior of all of these parts. I also went into the women's gallery and took details here. And then while I was here, I was also able to see a lot of the deterioration in the plaster from water damage, and everywhere I could, because I'm a preservationist, I took pictures of any deterioration I could find. So here, just some more details from different angles. Now here is my host, who's keeping an eye on me as I'm taking pictures, make sure I don't walk off with anything probably. And no, he was really a delightful guy, but he wanted to talk to me the whole time. And it was very hard to focus on taking pictures. And I include him in here because sometimes it's good to have a person in for scale, but I was looking for the same picture without him and I don't have it. So the only pictures I have of the looking toward the door all have a figure in it. It's not a problem, but usually we'll want something without people and then with people. And then here are a couple of little details. These are all taken with the telephoto lens there. Windows, mausoleums, lions. Okay. And then inside the sanctuary, it's the same kind of thing. This is the sanctuary of Temple Concord, a much simpler place. And this gives you a couple ideas of the corner shots. This is Bruce, my colleague Bruce, is using the box camera and he's shooting black and white film. I'm helping him set up the shots, because he doesn't know anything about synagogues, but he's a great photographer. So I'm giving him the views to shoot, but I'm also shooting in color digital. So we have two sets, and they're different. So this is looking from the corner, the front, looking toward the doorway. And this is one of those corner shots. This is a corner shot from the opposite view. So this is more or less the same axis from each end. And this is looking at the arc. And here there are lots of details that we would have to do that, although he was shooting large negative, so he didn't do all these details, but I did them in color. The Decalogue, the Ner Tamid, the inscription over the ark, the organ and the window, which is a later addition, the decoration, and so on. And we'll look at that in just a second. All right, so very quickly, details, many kinds of details to use. You recognize this. This is Charleston KKBE. I love this fence with all these different plaques. This must be one of the largest collections of plaques that any synagogue has. And this is a nice mood picture. It gives you a good sense of them all together. But ideally, I should have, but I don't think I did, have taken a direct shot on each plaque to get the writing, because the focus here is right in the center. So these ones are less legible, the ones on the sides. Going in, you want to get the details, every inscription. You never want to pass up an inscription. Windows, these windows are photographed beautifully, and it's harder to get the full tall windows because they're so enormous, but with a telephoto, you can get beautiful details. And because the sanctuary is wide enough, you actually can go across all the way to the opposite wall and shoot close up and get most of the windows. But sometimes you have to use a wider angle lens for that. Now we're back in Syracuse. These are the menorahs on the bima, and you want to get the menorah and the chairs, but you also want to make sure you get every little dedicatory plaque. Each one of these things has a little dedication plaque attached to it. Even the railing, look, it says railing donated by Mr. and Mrs. Herbert A. Silverman, 1980. You don't want to miss that. Synagogues are just filled with plaques. New architects and new congregations are trying to reduce the number of plaques, but and when they move, what do you do with all these plaques? It's a big problem. They end up in a basement somewhere. Artworks. This is a beautiful sculpture by Ivan Mestrovich, which is at Temple Concord. Here's this old chair. Here's the plaque of the committee, the building committee. These are atmospheric. They're very beautiful, but they're also very informative. The vestibule. This is KKBE again. I like this shot because we think of it as such a clean space, and yet when you look up in the corner, there's so much going on. It's so busy. And this shot, this is one of my shots, but it just shows so many different patterns: the organ, the fence, the balusters, the window pattern, the egg and dark molding, the coffering in the dome, the grating on the heating system. It's just to me indicative of. And those are as I say, when I hear a boring sermon, or even when it's not a boring sermon, and I'm sitting in a congregation, those are the kinds of things I like to look at. And this is some of the detail from Temple Concord. And then seating is very important. It tells a lot about the history of a congregation, and it often gets overlooked. So these are just some details of different types of seating. And when you see them all together, you realize how important it is. I don't know if anyone recognizes this. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's Beth Shalom in Elkins Park, which I visited last year and did all new photography. And I was dissatisfied with all the photographs that I was getting out of books because they were all these big general shots, very sexy, and I wanted to know the details. So I took about 100 or 200 details. This is one of my favorite. It just shows the mechanics of the seats because the floors slope so steeply, but the seats have to be level. But the leg space, one leg is always going to be slightly higher than the other. But each one is lower just about an inch and they step down. And then this is a new synagogue in Potomac, Maryland. And I was interested here because this is flexible seating, but these seats, which I think were manufactured in Israel, actually lock together. So you only need one rail instead of having two rails. And you can see you can have a double seat without rails if you like. And then I won't go into the Torah scrolls, but Torah scrolls should be fully documented. And that's really for security, because there's a lot of theft and damage to Torah scrolls, and they're very valuable. And if you have Torah scrolls in your congregation and you haven't registered them, there are several national or international programs which allow you to register, to number your Torah scroll using two main technologies. One is a kind of invisible ink that can be picked up and read, and the other is with pin pricks. And rabbis have sanctioned both of these. And that allows, if your Torah is ever stolen, that it can be identified and returned to you. Theft of Torahs has always happened, and it continues to happen. And it's usually Jews who steal them because they know how valuable they are. It's interesting, while we were documenting these Torah scrolls in Temple Concord, we were curious about the inscriptions on the rollers. And this is another story, but we worked with something called the Lazarus Project out of the University of Rochester. This one's very legible, but we had a number of them, including two that were Holocaust Torahs that came from the Memorial Scrolls Project in London that were illegible, but we were able to use infrared and other types of photography to read the inscriptions and identify the scribe and also the place where the Torah was written. So that's really cool. That's for another presentation though. And that wasn't really my work, but I was peripherally involved. Okay.
Dr. Gruber, can I interrupt? I wonder if we could stop for just a few minutes. It's almost 4:30.
Yeah,
and or at least ask if you can give us, tell us when the best time to stop would be.
No, this is it. That's the end of that's the end of the PowerPoint.
Okay.
So so we can I'll stay on, but people want to take a little break, and we'll just do it a little more. It'll be freewheeling when we come back, and we'll do questions.
And we do have a couple questions that came through on the chat that maybe we can take up first. Yeah. Okay. So my computer shows that it's 4:28. Let's meet back at 4:35. That gives you about 7 minutes to get a cup of water and to run to the bathroom.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll be right back too.
Back at 4:35, everybody. You can just stay, keep your screen going.
Yes. Oh, okay. Let me mute this. right, I am back. Let's see. Lily, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
I see that. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. We're gonna now move into more of a question and answer, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Gruber. You see those couple of
I do.
questions.
I do a couple questions. Okay. How unusual was it for American synagogues to have stained glass in this era? It was not unusual. I should say it was very common. It was especially common in Reform synagogues from the beginning in the 1870s and accelerating into the 1890s with more elaborate patterns, sometimes even figures after 1900. Lots of symbols, more expressly, purposely designed programs in the teens and the 20s. And then after World War II, modern synagogues tended to adopt modern art, often a mix of abstraction and symbolism tied to certain themes, life cycle events, Jewish holidays, the creation cycle and the like, and include these in synagogues too. I don't know how common stained glass was in all the synagogues in South Carolina because I haven't seen interior pictures, but you will know better. We know that most of the artists before World War II were not Jewish. The studios were the same ones that were making glass for churches. And of course, if you look at the glass in KKBE, which is now right behind me, but you're not seeing the glass, you'll know that it's almost identical to the glass in is it a Methodist? I forget the church. There's a church a few blocks away, which has very similar glass, done almost certainly by the same studio and same people in the 1880s. So, but there's nothing halakhically that forbids stained glass. We know that Jews actually experimented with stained glass in the Middle Ages, and different rabbis and different artists have given different interpretations, and so on. That's enough if anyone has more questions. The other questions, will we be able to get the text from this PowerPoint? Well, what I'll do is you'll have the recording of this talk, but I will make the PowerPoint available, though I would like to tweak it. And the text that I included on those slides, which give all the parts of a synagogue, I will reformulate. Actually, I've reformulated to put it on the PowerPoint, but I'll make it into more of a form, which all of you can have and use as a kind of text, a primer, as you think about your building. There are some things that are not included in there, other types of information that you might want to collect as well. I'll try to make it more complete. Do not be intimidated by the form. It is a universal, it's intended to be kind of universal and inclusive, but everything on the form is not going to apply to your particular synagogue. So, you don't feel that you get a 5-page form and say, this is going to take years to fill out. No, just follow it, walk around the building, and you'll be able to make sense of it. And should any post-processing be done, such as high dynamic? Yeah, okay. There's nothing wrong with doing post-processing with either film or digital. Basically, all printing of film is in a type of post-process. But I think you want to think about the purpose of your of the image, and that's going to impact the post-processing. I do very little post-processing except some light and color adjustment to compensate for over or under exposures. There are some really creative things you can do with stitching digital images together to get bigger views. If you shoot in RAW, which I advise, which I used to not do and now I do, you have a lot of information and a lot of possibilities. It just takes more storage. So probably you want to keep an external drive or a flash drive with a lot of gigs just for your documentation. And also you should make copies of this. Don't only have one copy, either have it on the cloud or have multiple. So if something happens, one is lost or damaged, destroyed or corrupted, you don't lose all the documentation. I haven't done it recently, but I do like to see have printouts as well, in part because I'm distrustful of the long-term security, the longevity of a lot of digital things, files, because I've lost so many things that I had online in the 90s. So multiple backups, upgrades to new systems, but also, print out, maybe not every image, but some images, keep them in a binder, use the best acid-free paper you can, and keep these in the archives of the congregation, or if you have a local historical archive, eventually they can go there. The more ways you preserve the data, the more likely it is that it will survive going forward. I think, like the pictures I showed you of the Sons of Jacob exteriors, I know people who wouldn't think twice about photoshopping out the poles and the wires and all those kinds of things. And I don't do it because I like to see the synagogues as they really are and the way people see them. But I can see a use for doing that, which is if you're just talking about the architecture, nothing else, and you want a cleaner view. And when I do that, and I have taken courses in Photoshop, but I just don't use it very much to that degree. I think it's really important just that you label things correctly. So you keep the original, and the copy should be labeled, altered, or clean, image altered with Photoshop or something like that, or whatever program. And if you're using it in a PowerPoint, or you should also indicate that as well. But if it's going to be for a postcard or for a greeting card or for a promotional kind of thing, no one's going to put that on that, that it's been altered. They want to use it. So I think it's just it's up to your own personal opinion. With stained glass windows, you can often people will shoot multiples at different light settings, and with stained glass, you really want to ideally use a tripod. I didn't use a tripod on any of those photos that I showed you because of time usually. And my camera is small and light and takes really good pictures. So I don't get I don't get much shake on it, but I may start using it, particularly with a tripod or a monopod with the telephoto, because the telephoto is so heavy it can cause a little bit of shake. And when you're doing stained glass windows, you don't want any shake at all, because you want to shoot like 3 exposures at different settings, one set for the ambient light. So that's going to show you the interior well, but the windows are just going to show up as white light. And then you want to focus on the windows and just get the light on that. And that will get you all the color and design, but everything around it will be dark and black. And some people, including me, sort of to date, have been happy just to keep those images separate. So you know that if you want to look at the interior, you look at one image. If you want to look at the stained glass, you look at the other. But I know I'm working on with a stained glass group, National Stained Glass Group, and we're talking about moving toward maybe a book with stained glass in it. And if we're going to publish images, you have to just have one image, and you want to have see the stained glass in the interior and relate it to the architecture. So there you would have the same shot twice, but at different exposures. And you can't move the camera even a fraction, otherwise they won't line up. So you have to be very, very careful. So the tripod, not only a tripod, but a shutter release cable would be advisable for that. And there are lots of kind of how-to videos and little instruction things online about how to shoot stained glass and other types of specialty situations. And the same thing with cropping. I think cropping is okay. And by perspective cropping, I assume you're meaning like the adjustments to get rid of the slanting lines. Yeah, I think that's okay. We used to do that with film all the time with perspective correction lenses, and it gives a little bit of distortion, but it's actually much less distortion than just taking it from the camera, because when we look at a stained glass window, we don't really see it look like that. We see it in our mind's eye, we see it right. So I think that's okay as well. Just always keep the original and label your when you're using as a copy. So I see Mitchell's pointing at me. That's okay with you? Yeah. So go ahead and do that. It's just very time consuming. So, but it's fulfilling and it's good. Okay. Are there any other questions or topics? You can unmute yourself and we can pursue that. And tell me a bit about your synagogues and what the situations and what the problems are, and we can address those. Anybody?
Can you hear me?
I can, Barbara.
I'm in Camden, South Carolina. Our little synagogue was built a little over 100 years ago, and it is in the National Register and the local historic society. I don't know if it's made it anywhere, anyplace else. There was a man from Anderson who came down and took some beautiful pictures of our synagogue, and he took pictures of the synagogue in Sumter and Columbia as well, and put them in a book. And he sent me a copy of the book, and he took some beautiful pictures, and he was just taking a photography course, but that's about the only photographs that I have of our temple. And everything else that I know about it, I just know about it because I'm old and I've been around a long time. So the windows in our synagogue, a kid from across the street about 40 years ago walked around and shot out our original windows. And so I replaced them. We had a guy here in Camden. Yeah, that's our temple. I have had it cleaned. We had a guy here in Camden. I don't know if you can see the star in the front, not there. It's
up here?
No, down here is a sculpture.
Oh.
And I don't think you can see it in that picture. I think it's covered by those trees. Mm-hmm. But he designed the new windows that are there now. And the Star of David he's got lying on its side. And I thought that was really different. And we've done some extraordinary work in keeping this building viable. About 4 years ago, I had the roof fall in, and the ceiling fall in, no rhyme or reason. And we replaced all of that. But and I keep the Torah in my house. I don't leave it in the synagogue. We only use it for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur now. So if you ever come to Camden and you can see the building, it's clean now. We've had it cleaned, so it looks much better.
Yeah, it's an interesting little building. I remember reading about it. Was it built as a church, or was it?
Yes, it was originally built as the Catholic Church. In fact, the Catholic Church right down the street is built the same style, that same Mexican looking style. And they kept it as a church for a very short period of time. They quickly outgrew it, and it stood empty for a few years. And the Hebrew Benevolent Association in Camden bought it around 1920. I'm going to say 1920. So it's been a temple. It's a Reformed congregation, and it's been a temple since 1920. Been in that structure
For 100 years, really quite.
Yeah, 100 years.
So are there additional buildings, ancillary spaces to it, or is it mostly just the sanctuary? Because
there is a building directly behind the sanctuary that was built in the late 50s, I think, that was used as a meeting place, Sunday school classroom, and has a little kitchen in it. And we have a congregation of maybe 11 people, not families, people. So we don't use that space. And so I use it to get income for our congregation. I rent it to the JCs.
So was the guy who took the photographs, was his name Bill Fitzpatrick?
No, Bill Fitzpatrick came here as well. And hold on just a sec. Bill Fitzpatrick, he sent me a copy of his coffee table book. And if you look at the picture of Temple Bethel, that's me waving at the door.
I see. Okay. Well,
But this one is it's called Door of the Door, and it was done by Mitch Litworth.
Who's on the call, by the way?
Oh, okay.
Mitchell is on the call today with us.
Mitch, I need to get a contact to get a copy of your book.
Well, I'm sorry that our building needed a good cleaning before he took the pictures, because the building is really beautiful, and now that we've had it cleaned, it really stands out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing. I'm looking for them here. Whoops.
But you can see that
the whole ceiling had collapsed at one time.
The whole ceiling had collapsed while he was there, and we were in the process of getting all of that fixed. What I don't think that was done in the building itself was in the shape of a cross, and the two side rooms have the original windows in them. I did not replace those windows, and I guess it's the historian in me that wanted to keep that, because those were the original windows.
Right. Well, I think that was a good decision. Well, it sounds like the synagogue there is, first of all, it's small enough so it's a manageable space to document, and it's not filled with stuff. It's got the pews, it's got the windows, a few other things. So each of those can get its due. It sounds like you've had people already doing some good photography, so you're already most of the way there.
Yeah, I feel.
Yeah, so for photography, and then you just link that up with the history of which you already also seem to be pretty well, on top of. It might be interesting, if you haven't already, to have a site plan drawn and a plan of an actual measured drawings of the building.
Okay.
If that's never been done, that's something you can usually, I don't know where the nearest architecture school for you is, but it's frequently possible. I was just been in touch with people in, Bryant, Texas, and someplace else. I was just thinking someplace else where they've had local historic preservation students and architecture students come and do do drawings for the old synagogues. So that's something you could look into as a way of enhancing your documentation. But what you do, and then you've already done all this work and cleaning, so you're really probably not in need of a conservation plan either, but you might want to just lay out, for the future, some guidelines, a record of everything you've done, if you haven't done,
Yeah.
then guidelines, what people should be doing in the future to make sure things don't deteriorate again.
Well, I don't know, and maybe you do, if someplace like a local historic society would be willing to take over the upkeep of that building once I'm gone.
Rachel's shaking her head.
Rachel shaking her head.
Barbara, you have to have the conversation with Joe and Andy, who are going through this in Spartanburg, and also talk to Annie Rivers in Sumter. They can at least give you some ideas, because Camden, you might have some options in Camden, but it's not too soon to start talking to them about
No, it isn't, because I'm closer to the end than I am the beginning. And I
Nah, you got ways to go.
I know that. And
the situation in Bryan, Texas, which I just mentioned, sounds kind of similar, because there the congregation had this classical style 1920s building, but they in the 60s or 70s they moved closer to Texas A&M, but they continued to own the building, but one of their congregants kept it up and sort of managed it and allowed itinerant congregations, churches, others to use it. But he is either very old or has maybe passed away recently, but the decision was made that he couldn't continue to do this, and an agreement was made with the city of Bryan, and they took over the building. And then there's a restoration project going on now, which is spearheaded by the city, and it's going to be continued to allow, I think, the churches and others, but it's going to be a public hall, a community hall that could be used for many different types of lectures, classes, yoga, whatever they need it for. And the city I believe the city will administer it, although there's some talk about setting up a separate friends group that would actually take on the job of booking and things like that. And that's what I think Andy and Joe have also been looking at, that kind of model as one option in Spartanburg. That's the kind of thing that requires the least change and intervention in the space. And you just have to, you just have to bring it up to code, usually for Americans with Disabilities Act access, and with bathrooms and electric and all those kinds of things, if you're changing the purpose. Some communities, though, moving from a religious place of religious worship to some other kind of assembly hall is not considered a significant enough change of purpose, so you can actually grandfather in some of the old systems. But it makes sense for insurance purposes, liability, other kinds of things, to take the opportunity, redo the electric, redo the plumbing, do all those kinds of things. And that's where the real costs are involved. And you need fire, sprinkler systems, fire prevent, whatever the local code requires. I don't know, but it is not rocket science. It is something that is done fairly regularly, not just with synagogues, with lots of old, it could be an Oddfellows Hall, it could be a American Legion Hall, it could be the Sons of Poland, we have so many of these around American towns and cities, because we were a country of joiners. Everybody belonged to clubs and groups and churches and synagogues, and now not so much. So we have this surplus of buildings. So there's been a lot of conversions of these buildings. So that may be the way. But if you want what Joe and Andy are talking about is whatever the use is in Spartanburg, that there would be a permanent exhibition, wall panels or something like those, or even the very ones that they prepared for the conference of the Historical Society the other year, that these would be then there in some space or on the walls that would be telling the story of the Jewish community. And again, you do need it's a lot of work though. So, you need somebody with the energy and time. And then it will cost some money, but it's more work than money often.
Yeah.
through this
Mhm. I'll check on that.
Anybody else? Somebody, Dale asked again. Okay, Mitchell, I'll put in my address here, but is the Legacy Project still operative? This is the Jewish Community Legacy Project that was being run out of Georgia, I guess. I think it still is operative, but it's very small. It's like 2 people who are doing it all. But the idea is to reach out to congregations significantly before they close, to give them time to plan and then to look for ways for them to protect and to use those assets that are that they have, and that could be money or it could be property, and those things that are specific to the mission of the Jewish to Judaism, to find new homes where they will be used and appreciated. So it's a range of things, from Torah scrolls going to another congregation. Prayer books might be buried, in a cemetery if they're old and nobody wants them. But other things might be distributed to congregations, to universities, to Hillels, to even sent to other countries. Yeah, so they kind of keep a registry and try to match up with that. I believe they were involved in Sumter in some form, but maybe just early on in advising. I don't think they actually did the heavy lifting on that project.
No, Sam, they were, the Legacy Project was deeply involved in Sumter from the beginning to the end.
Oh, okay.
We actually, we had a meeting, after the sort of the inauguration of the History Center, and I'm not calling their names right now, but the 2 guys you just referenced.
I've had lunch with,
Jay Schwartz and
Marty?
Jay Schwartz and Roger Ackerman.
Roger, yeah, Jay is, yeah. So I knew they were, so they stayed involved. So Sumter really then is one of their great achievements, because that's
great triumph.
I really think that's a exemplary, project and should be used and promoted everywhere.
That was led by a group that started quite a few years ahead before the synagogue. I grew up in Temple Sinai, and they had some great foresight, and they did work with the Legacy Project, but they also spent a long time contacting former members of the community, of the synagogue, wherever they were, and people all contributed. Plus they got a very nice grant from Central Carolina Community Foundation. So it was, it took a long time to do it, but they did it right. And it's definitely a really good case study.
It obviously speaks to the tremendous integration of the synagogues and the Jewish congregations in these towns, because of course the partner, the county museum, is literally housed in a formerly Jewish historic home, and their archives is just absolutely full of Moises and Moseses and everybody, all the Harbees, all the important people. And the Jews are just a very important part of that town. So the county took it on. I think Walterboro might have a similar situation with the Colleton County Museum, which might help out if Walterboro gets in trouble.
We have Penny is here, Penny Blackman. Any of y'all had discussions?
You're muted, Penny.
Sorry. Have we had discussions? I believe Jane possibly has, but I'll check into that. Jane Siegel, my sister. But we will need some help, probably soon.
Can I ask Barbara, is there a cemetery connected or affiliated with the Camden Synagogue?
Absolutely, I take care of that too.
Well, I think that's where the metal meets the road kind of thing. I mean, I think the big thing is to figure out who is going to take over the the management of the cemetery? And are there still plots available for members to upon their death to be buried in?
Yes.
So, I think one of the things I learned from the Sumter Project is they approached both Charleston Federation and I'm not sure if they actually came to Columbia, but to find out if the synagogue in Charleston or the Federation would oversee the grounds and the perpetuation of the Jewish cemetery. And I think that would be something that, you might want to approach one of your closest communities, maybe Columbia, which might be the closest, or again, as to the cemetery, and then the building itself will be another discussion, but could all be in one discussion. Annie Rivers might be a good one to talk to if she, because I think she was pretty much involved. Was she not, Rachel, at the beginning? No? Okay.
No, Annie's relatively new. Sumter had, and Dale can speak more to this, but Sumter had a very good relationship with Charleston because the Sumter was founded by former members of KKBE. So the Coastal Carolina Community Foundation holds, and I'm not sure of all the financial aspects, but they hold the funds there, the trust, for perpetual care for the cemetery in Sumter, and they take care of that. And some, you got different cemetery situations across the state, but I'm hearing from people across the state who send us emails about Jewish cemeteries, and documenting our synagogues is very important, but people are very concerned about these cemeteries. Some of them are the Jewish section of a municipal cemetery, which I think Walterboro is, right, Penny? And Orangeburg is, but Camden, it has their own. In King Street, they have their own Jewish cemetery, but they sold their building. And I think the funds from that went into a fund for perpetual care. Everybody's work, and I've heard from people from Darlington about theirs. So this is it's not just statewide. I'm sure this, and Sam could talk to this, a universal problem, but it's very acute in South Carolina
very
now.
briefly.
Rachel, Camden Cemetery is more like Sumter in the sense that it's the Jewish section of the cemetery is within the bounds of the other denominations, and it's directly across from a Revolutionary War site. So it's a very historic site. The Camden Cemetery, and then of course in Sumter, it's also part of the municipal.
No, it's not.
It's not.
No, it's totally separate.
It's a
Sumter is very unusual. in that.
The Sumter Cemetery is actually across the street from the I don't know if that's a public cemetery for any denomination or anybody wants to be buried there. And then and Camden is actually surrounded. Camden Cemetery is actually surrounded by the Quaker Cemetery.
Wow, that's interesting.
And
it's like an interesting study. Someone should plot the because they're very different. Definitely, many communities that have, and the Legacy Project has worked on this, but others have as well. I mean, a big concern is often to liquidate the property and take the money and endow the cemetery for care, and look for other ways to monetize the assets to provide for the cemetery. Some states have done more collective organizing, Massachusetts, and I know Texas was talking about it. I don't think they've done it though, where there would be an organization that would be established out of different federations or other Jewish institutions, probably with some support from foundations to provide care for the abandoned cemeteries and for some of the others. I know for many years, Don Teeter in Texas, was working toward that, identifying and setting up care situations. I think there are a lot of ways to explore it, but it definitely is something that's important and should be on the agenda of the Historical Society and also of the religious communities, and they might work collectively. There are and then there are often agreements that are made with adjacent or, cemeteries for care, but they're with payment. So the Quakers would mow the grass and they would do whatever they do there. If they're taking care of their cemetery, they take care of the Jewish cemetery for a fee, an annual fee, which would ideally be no more than the interest on the endowed fund that exists. And if there's room for new burials, that would also be an opportunity to add some funds if there was a payment for burial, to the cemetery. Other places have talked about putting a tax on burials, essentially, that for every, through funeral directors and others, that there's a $10 or $100, whatever it is, fee attached. And then that goes into a fund to support abandoned cemeteries. But that idea, which has been put forward in many places at many times over the last 30 years, I don't know whether it's ever caught on. That may be the model that's used in Massachusetts, but I'm not sure.
They tried that here in Camden, where the funeral home paid a fee to the cemetery. And when Bernie Baum passed away, that ceased to happen. So, I mean, since I don't know who to yell at because I'm in charge of the cemetery, I'm in charge of the temple as well. So I remember calling Carnegie Funeral Home and asking them, wasn't there a fee that they paid in order to bury somebody in our cemetery? And they said, oh, no, we don't do that anymore.
All right, well, we're getting near the end of time, but a couple things I'm remembering that I forgot to say. One is about filming and video. Most people have filming capacity, video capacity, really many cameras. I know mine does and phones do have really broadcast quality, can take broadcast quality video. I don't think video is an alternative to photography because I think they're used very different ways. But if you have the time, you can do both. You usually can't do both simultaneously. Sometimes a walkthrough with video in which you talk to the camera and are describing what you see is very useful for the congregation to have as a record, but it also can help planning other types of documentation, or it can raise questions. You'll keep coming across things that you can't explain, and then you need to pursue that. So I think of the video as more of a research tool rather than as an end result. If you're actually going to do a video on the history of your congregation, you're going to want to get someone who's more professional and has the equipment and knows the process, the editing, the lighting, the audio, to do that. But for documentation, video is good, but I think it's not preferred. It's also, I think people just don't look at video quite as much. They might have it and it's useful to have, but if it goes more than a few minutes, it's not going to engage. And then, as I said, many multimedia, the more the merrier type of documentation that's going to be your primary one. The National Register now accepts digital, but so you don't have to worry about, film it at all. A little more parsimonious, you do your editing mostly on site rather than afterward on your computer. I've put my email on the chat. If anyone has questions, or if you're going to go out and take some pictures and want to talk about it, you can let me know. I think for this project, I would think if you're going to contact me, you should probably CC it with her permission to Rachel and maybe to Dale, because they're closer to the subject, and they actually may be able to help more. But also, it's really important, I think, to keep one hand knows what the other's doing, and so if you're doing a project, let other people know, and they can help you or they're certainly not going to hinder you. So it's kind of thing.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Gruber, so much for an enlightening couple of hours and the instructions, which now seem so simple, but would have been terribly overlooked if we hadn't heard the analysis, the organizational way that you go through by trying to document the synagogue. Thank you so much. And I feel sure that, yeah, that's what we all say. I feel sure that maybe it'll be appropriate as a follow-up in a few months, 6 months, maybe even a year, to get back together to see if there are questions or there are new advances that need to be considered. I'd like to remind everybody that the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina it has 2 programs coming up. March 30th, which is actually through PBS. It is the showing of the film, The Blinding of Isaac Woodard. And this was based on a book that was written by Judge Richard Gergel of Charleston. His book, Unexampled Courage, will have a discussion with Richard and Pat Sullivan and who is the director, Jamal Efron, on the 31st of March, and that will start at 7 o'clock. So please register with the society if you're interested in seeing or hearing that. Join us as a member on jhssc.org or visit our Facebook page. All Zoom links can be found there. We say goodbye. Hope to hear from you all soon. Keep in touch. And wear your masks where appropriate and get your vaccine whenever it's your turn. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.